Good morning. This is Pastor Becca here on this Thursday morning. I hope you're having a wonderful start to your day. I wanted to share a word from the Lord with you from Exodus chapter 3 this morning, and we will be reading verses 1 through 10. Exodus chapter 3, and we'll be reading verses 1 through 10. Again, we're going to be continuing on this theme of holy interruptions. And this Exodus 3 text is actually our scripture reading to go with our sermon on Sunday. And so you will hear this on Sunday, but I wanted to provide just a little bit of a background on this particular holy interruption in the life of Moses this morning. So Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. I invite you to hear the word of the Lord. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And this is the word of the Lord for us this morning. Thanks be to God. This text today, again, shows another interruption in the life of one of God's people. Moses is here in the wilderness watching his father-in-law's sheep. He's herding sheep just like he does every other day. When all of a sudden he sees this burning bush. Now, in the wilderness, in the desert area, it's not that unusual to see a burning bush. It's a dry, hot place. Bushes oftentimes catch fire, but there's something interesting about this burning bush. Though the bush is on fire, it doesn't burn up. And it seems like such an anomaly to Moses that it catches his attention, and he goes over to take a closer look at this burning bush. And when he comes closer, he encounters the very voice of God who calls out to him, Moses, Moses. And Moses responds, Here I am. And God begins in the space of this interruption to prepare Moses and to call Moses to what God has planned in the coming days, not just for Moses, but for God's people, Moses's people, the people of Israel. God shares with Moses these plans that Moses is going to be sent back to Egypt. Now, remember, Moses is out here in the wilderness watching sheep because things did not go well last time. He had to flee from Egypt. He had, if you remember the story, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. He was brought in by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised very much as an Egyptian, though he had the Hebrew heritage. But he began to see the way his people, the Hebrews, the slaves, were being treated. And one day he had come across an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And he became so angered at the sight of this that he killed the Egyptian. And worried for his life, he fled to the wilderness. Moses is not here in the wilderness by choice. Moses is here in the wilderness by necessity because things did not go well last time he was in Egypt. But here in the space of this interruption, God calls Moses back to the very place from where Moses had fled in fear. God calls Moses back to the place where Moses is most afraid. Moses feels least equipped to do what God has called him to do. But still, God calls him to go back because God is a God who has seen the oppression of God's people. He has heard their cries, and this God, Yahweh, is a God who is going to come down and deliver God's people from the hands of the mighty Egyptians. And God is going to use Moses to do this. This is a holy interruption. It's a holy, sacred space. This is holy ground that Moses is standing on. This isn't how Moses saw his day going. He started his day probably like any other. He's out there watching his father-in-law Jethro's sheep, probably like any other. And yet in the space of this interruption, in the space of this item that was not planned out for his day, Moses' life is radically changed as he is given this call from God to go back to Egypt. And in the space of this interruption, not only is Moses' life forever changed, but the lives of God's people are forever changed by Moses' obedience to do as God has asked. It seems like such a small interruption, a burning bush, a brief moment in the midst of a long day of watching sheep. And yet it is one of those holy interruptions that forever changes the course of one's life, that forever changes the course of a people. But it is in the space of this interruption that God opens up new space for God to do something new in and through God's people. And here, in this case, in and through God's servant, Moses. Church, so often we avoid interruptions. We try to do whatever we can to limit interruptions, but we're reminded in Scripture that it's in the space of interruptions that God so often does God's best work. It's in the space of interruptions that in it the entire course of one's life can be changed. The entire course of a people can be changed. The question is, are we as God's people going to respond faithfully? In the space of that interruption, are we going to make space for God to work? Are we going to risk for what God is calling us to do? Are we going to be a people who respond in obedience? My prayer is that we would be. My prayer is that we will be a people who look in the space of interruptions, not as a nuisance, not as an annoying part of our day, but as an opportunity for God to work, an opportunity for God to open our eyes to something new that God is doing in our midst, an opportunity for God to call us in new ways to be a part of the plan and the work that our God is so faithfully already doing. Church, receive this benediction. May the peace of Christ be with you today. And when you come into the interruptions in your day, rather than being frustrated, I invite you to look for God's hand in the midst of it. Listen for God's voice calling to you in the midst of it. And may you be faithful to respond as Moses did. Lord, here I am. Blessings.